I'm going to spend a little bit of time today talking about what does it mean to lead as a Christian. I almost broke this down into 3 different sermons, but I decided I would come back and actually kind of combine it. And we'll look at a couple of different areas as we talk about our responsibility as Christians to be leaders. And I will say this, if I don't do a long enough of a job covering the third point, I might try to go back by your guys' request and cover it in a different way. So let's start talking and look at the scriptures for just a little bit about what it means to lead as a Christian. Now, oftentimes when you hear someone talk about leaders, we have a preconceived idea in our mind that we're really only talking about those people who are actually in charge. And of course, spiritually we think of Christ when we begin to think of our head and the idea of leading. But within the church, we'll actually oftentimes pick out other certain groups, and we'll think maybe possibly of elders, preachers or teachers, people that we look up to within the congregation itself. And that's a pretty good job as far as defining traditional ideas regarding positions of leaderships. But I think when you take the Bible's teachings, and you begin to really dig into them, you'll find that there is a mandatory requirement for all of us as Christians to be leaders, and that will carry over into a lot of areas within our lives. We have roles within marriages, within our families, even within the church itself. And so let me look at some of those real quick, and let's talk a little bit about the requirements for us as Christians. Now again, we'll start off with the question here, well, what exactly is somebody who is a leader? If you go back and actually look on Google, the old web interface, it will give you a simple definition of somebody who leads, somebody who guides others, somebody who is in charge, somebody who is in command, somebody who has influence, somebody who has power, and the list would go on and on. As we begin to study the Scriptures, what we find is that as Christians, we are all to be able to guide others by our influence. We do that in a number of ways, not only through just teaching the gospel and teaching biblical doctrine, but in the way that we interact with other people. And so, whether we like it or not, we are going to actually influence others in our daily lives. That could be good and that could be bad, really based on your actual actions yourself. But it's certainly important as we begin to break this down that as Christians, we are required to lead, and we're going to lead one way or the other. For some, it will be good. For some, if they're not faithful, it will be bad. Now, let's talk about character for a minute. This is something that certainly is needed for those of us who are Christians. It's needed for those who would lead the church. It's needed for those who are going to lead their homes. It's needed in all regards, right? It would be needed in our workplaces where we work. Listen to Ephesians 4. I'm going to read verses 13 through 15. Paul, as he writes to the church in Ephesus, and I'll make application here in a second, he says, "Till we all come in the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, unto a perfect man, unto the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, that we henceforth be no more children, tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine, by the sleight of men and cunning craftiness, whereby they lie in wait to deceive. But speaking the truth in love, may grow up into him in all things, which is the head, even Christ." As I was sitting and thinking about this as a whole, certainly God intends for us as Christians to effectively work. Now, part of that work is not only within the church itself, but part of that work is when we go out on a daily basis and we're amongst those that are out in the world. The goal is for everyone to be in unity in the faith. That's a drastic goal, but that's really the ultimate goal. And if we do this correctly, and we hope this would include our children, our loved ones, our friends, the goal is for us to get as many people to obey the gospel and be faithful to the faith as possible. And I think that we understand that Paul realized how big of a job this was, as we see evident by the missionary journeys. And I think people would look at Paul as being a leader. I don't know if anybody worked any harder than Paul. Do you guys ever get the feeling that Paul maybe thought he could have done just a little bit more? I sometimes wonder to what extent Paul really thought he was a leader. He was a leader because you could see him carrying out the teaching and the living of the gospel. What we often associate with leadership is somebody who is entrusted with authority over another person. But guys, at some level, every single one of us is to lead. We will lead by example, and I'm going to go back and look at Jesus' words here in a little bit. But whether you like it or not, you have to lead in every aspect of your life, and we'll talk about how exactly you can do that. With influence, oftentimes, whether we realize it or not, we can be leading in an indirect way. And what I mean is you may not actually be leading the congregation in some biblical role, as we find, in a position of eldership or something like that. You may not be in a position at your workplace where you're in charge of, let's say, other employees. But in every one of those situations, there are people who are watching and learning what it is that you are doing. You are literally leading just simply by being a faithful Christian. You're going to impact people, and they will be looking at the decisions that you make, and they will be looking at how you influence others, okay? Certainly as Christians, we are called to be different, and we are. Listen to Romans 12:2. Paul says, "And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God." This is one of the greatest things we can do to impact our families, our secular jobs and the people that we are around, our friends, our families, our marriages. We literally are leading on a daily basis through the decisions that we're making. As a matter of fact, listen to what Peter says in 1 Peter 4. I'm going to start in verse 1 and read down to verse 4. Because you have to realize that when you begin to live as a faithful Christian, you may not think that you're leading anybody, but you certainly are, and the world around you sees that you're different. "For as much then as Christ hath suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind. For he that hath suffered in the flesh hath ceased from sin, that he should no longer live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lust of men, but to the will of God. For the time past of our life may suffice us to have wrought the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lasciviousness, lusts, excess of wine, revelings, banquetings, and abominable idolatries, wherein they think it strange that ye run not with them to the same excess of riot, speaking evil of you." I think for most of us who, especially were raised maybe outside of the church or did not obey the gospel until later in life, we would look back and say, unfortunately, I lived like the world too long. And certainly for those of us who are Christians, we know we did it long enough, and we look back and we can't even really justify within our mind how it is that we lived the way that we used to once live. But the problem is there are still people who are living like that right now. And so to us who've come out of the world, whether we're working with them, whether it's maybe even our children who are growing up, and guys, the society around us they want our children as much as they want us. They look at the way that we live, and to them it is extremely unusual. It is strange, and it should be. It should be extremely strange. And yet when we live like that, and when we show that we're not going to conform to the world, we literally are leading through example. And you may say that, I don't know that anybody really is being impacted. Somebody is. Somebody is being impacted, and you may not even realize it. And think about this, even if you really only impact one person, exponentially, if they impact their children, and their children have children, and their children have children, you're talking exponential generations that could be impacted just because of one decision you make. Listen to what Jesus says, because guys, we are the minority. Matthew 7, starting in verse 13, he says, "Enter ye in at the strait gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction, and many there be which go in thereat." Let me pause for a second. That's where the world is going. That's not where we as faithful Christians are to be going. That's where the world is going. That's why when they look at us, we seem to be so strange. And so as we don't take that wide path, that wide gate, as we're taking the narrow gate, whether we believe it or not or see it or not, we literally are trying to lead them towards Christ. Verse 14, because straight is the gate and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, listen to this, and few there be that find it. Who's that few? That few is going to be those who are faithful. Those are the ones that find it. You go back to the broad gate, the one that everyone's taking, who are those people? Our family members, our co-workers, members of the church who are in error. The list goes on and on and on. We do make a difference. We are leading when we are faithful. We are trying to get people to understand that there is that straight gate. Paul says that it's not being conformed to the world. Paul says this in 2 Corinthians 6, 17 and 18. Wherefore come out from among them and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you, and will be a father unto you, and ye shall be my sons and daughters, saith the Lord Almighty. For those of us who are normally here for Bible studies and sermons, you'll hear me all the time talk about God making these promises to us of, if you will, I will. If you'll do this, I will be your God. If you'll do this, I'll do... This is one of those statements right here. If you will be separate from the world, you'll be my sons and my daughters. You will lead as sons and daughters in a world around us who again will look at us and go, why are they the way that they are? It appears to be extremely strange. You're going to stand out. That idea of trying to blend in with the crowd, which so many people want to do because they don't feel comfortable standing out, you're going to stand out. It doesn't matter if you don't want to stand out. You are not going to be like the world around you. That is going to draw attention to yourself. And it's a good thing. By standing out like that, you will have influence on other people. Listen to what Jesus says in Matthew 13:33. Another parable spake he unto them, the kingdom of heaven is like unto leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal, till the whole was leavened. Now, these are what we call the kingdom parables. We've spoken about the kingdom parables before. They are specifically regarding the church. And here, Jesus says Christians, what will become Christians, those in the kingdom, they are to be like leaven. Now, what's interesting is this is actually one of the few instances where leaven doesn't actually represent sin, but portrays what happens when we as Christians are different from the world. And this would include our living out and our teaching of the gospel, which is supposed to produce a leavening effect as we are out amongst the world. And again, they're asking, why are you the way that you are? It is supposed to be one of those things that helps us to grow the gospel. And guys, this leavening influence isn't just for the world around us. It's for our homes. You don't think that your children are watching the things that you do? You don't think they hear the things that you say? Certainly, we know that our little ones do. But it's not just even our little ones within the home. People at work, they hear the types of things that you say. They hear the ways that you speak. I've mentioned before, it's interesting. People don't normally use profanity when they're talking. I'll hear it out on the production floor, but they don't do that in my presence. And if they do, they usually will apologize. People will realize that you're different. So we certainly are leading even when we don't think that we are. And that leavening effect is to take place. Now, there's a lot of ways that we could lead, and this would probably need some different sermons if we want to break these down more specifically than I have already. Well, let's go on over to Matthew 5, 13 through 16. We'll continue up with Jesus. He says, Ye are the salt of the earth, but if the salt have lost his savor, wherewith shall it be salted? It is thenceforth good for nothing, but to be cast out and to be trodden under foot of men. Ye are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. He's talking about leading. Now Jesus didn't come out and say, hey, let me have a lectureship on how to lead as the followers of Christ. But that's exactly what he's doing right there. He is talking about the fact that you're going to influence people. And matter of fact, you don't want to hide that. You want to influence people. That's the entire purpose. Philippians 2:15, Paul, he writes to the church there in Philippi, that ye may be blameless and harmless, the sons of God without rebuke, in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, among whom ye shine as lights in the world. We are reminded that people are always watching. And whether for good or for bad, somebody is watching and learning from you, and we're learning from others. Have you guys ever thought to yourself, especially those who have children right now, how scary it is, what it is that they are seeing on TV and what it is they are seeing on social media? Because they are learning from others. You don't exactly know, if you're not monitoring what's being watched, you don't know exactly what they're learning. But you understand within your mind, they learn just by observing. Well, the same is true for people out in the world. They learn from observing. And our goal is for them to observe us as Christians as we try to draw them to the faith. We have an opportunity where we can influence them. And the Bible is very clear that we as Christians are to be people of integrity. The idea of integrity is this. When I am challenged with something, a temptation, a trial, a struggle, I am not going to break under pressure. It's the idea that as a Christian, I'm going to hold fast. Listen to Proverbs 10:9. He that walketh uprightly walketh surely, but he that perverteth his ways shall be known. There's a lot of confidence for those of us who are walking according to the faith. Not one of those ideas of where you kind of have your head down, almost being ashamed because you're so different from the world, but the idea of a head held high, saying, I'm being the way that I'm being for a specific reason as a follower of Christ. Proverbs 11:3, the integrity of the upright shall guide them, but the perverseness of transgressors shall destroy them. Again, the Bible is constantly contrasting sin versus integrity. Constantly. And I'm going to say another thing, and we'll get to it here in a few minutes. The Bible doesn't hide the failures of those within the Scriptures. That's one of the ways that you know that the Bible is actually true. It comes right out and says, here's a follower of God, and guess what they did? And the Bible says, basically as example, guys, don't do that. That didn't work out well, so don't do that. And we'll look at some of those here in a few minutes. 2 Peter 1:5, Peter writes, and besides this, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge. What's he saying? Be virtuous, but also, again, have that based on knowledge, on the Scriptures, on the will of God. Virtue is defined as moral excellence. It's a foundational quality for our faith. You cannot have faith apart from that knowledge. Now, I don't think this needs to be overemphasized because it can't be, but our world, guys, just look around. Our world desperately needs to see people of integrity. They see this when we as Christians stand up for what the Bible teaches as being right, even when the world around us doesn't agree with that. Others are going to be impacted by that, and by being grounded in God's Word, we are more easily able to influence those around us. Paul actually says this to Timothy in 2 Timothy 2:15. He writes it to him. He says, study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. Now if you go back and look at that word there, he's telling Timothy to be a workman. The word there actually is a laborer. Guys, I hate to tell you this, if you didn't already know, it takes an awful lot of work for you to lead by example. And every one of us as Christians is required to work. And that work is based on our knowledge of the Scriptures, rightly dividing the word. When we rightly divide the word of truth, and we live by that, we are leading and being an example to all those people around us. But guys, I'm going to tell you again, it's going to be work. And this leadership is clearly visible in the defending of the faith. Peter writes this in 1 Peter 3:15, "But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear." Peter says you guys better be ready to give a defense. And as I was thinking about this in this lesson, how many of you guys remember when your little ones would watch you and they would say, "Why do you do that? Why are you doing that way?" Right? Why? There will come those times when you will have those questions regarding the faith, regarding the church. Why do we go to Bible study on Sundays and Wednesdays? Or I guess, let me flip the coin. Why do we skip Bible studies on Sunday morning? Or why do we skip worship on Sunday? They're always asking why. Peter says you better be ready to give a defense. And in context, he's actually looking at it in a positive way, right? Be able to defend the faith on why you do what you do. But I'm going to flip the coin and say, guys, when you choose to not live by the Scriptures, whether you know it or not, you're literally doing the exact same thing. And they're in their mind, they're thinking, why do they do that? And I'll tell you this, as we find that the younger generation, they say, are leaving the church, many of them have realized the hypocrisy they see amongst those who call themselves Christians, and they don't want anything to do with it. And I'm a firm believer in they know when they're looking at something and it's a fraud. I believe this generation, this younger generation they say is leaving the faith, I think it's because they've been raised by many and seen people around them who clearly were hypocritical and not living the faith. And I can think of many others who would say they've seen the church and looked at it and said, if that's how Christians behave, I don't want anything to do with it. That's not the example we want to give. We want to give the example of being faithful, being a leader who will defend the faith and who can answer the questions as to why. And guys, when we are generally grounded in the Scriptures, we're not going to be swayed by error. I say generally because I'm going to give you an example here in a little bit of somebody who knew better, but didn't do better. And for most of us who will be honest, we'll say it's probably happened in our own lives. Listen to 2 Timothy 4, verses 2 through 4. Now, Paul here, of course, as he writes to Timothy, he says preach to start off there. That word there is actually to herald or to proclaim. And many of you, whether male or female, will be asked by other people, hey, can you please teach and or proclaim to me what it is you believe as a Christian? Okay, now in context, he's talking to Timothy, but this happens to all of us. We all get asked to preach, technically the word here, teach, to explain. So in a sense, this applies to all of us. But in context, he says to Timothy, preach, herald, proclaim the word, to be instant in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with all longsuffering and doctrine. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lusts shall they heap to themselves teachers having itching ears, and they shall turn away their ears from the truth and shall be turned unto fables. There are a lot of people who are either not grounded in the faith or literally have virtually no knowledge whatsoever of the faith. And in general conversations, they're going to ask you to proclaim, Peter would say, to be ready to answer for the reason of hope that is in you with meekness and fear. Paul says we need to be able to proclaim this. Well, it's easily seen within us when we stand for the truth, especially when things get hostile. Listen to Ephesians 4:16. From whom the whole body fitly joined together and compacted by that which every joint supplieth, according to the effectual working in the measure of every part, maketh increase of the body unto the edifying of itself in love. Now, you may say, why would you choose that passage as you're talking about defending the faith? The body of Christ will continue to grow when every single person is doing its share. It starts in the home with our little ones. It continues in the home in the way that we interact within our marriages. It's carried over into the body of Christ in so many different areas and even throughout the the roles within the body, of whether you're looking at the faithful ministers within the congregation, whether you're looking at the elders within the congregation, or whether you're just looking at, as some would say, just general Christian, the normal, everyday Christian being faithful and doing what they can for the body. Now again, we oftentimes only think of this passage here specifically talking about the work of the church. Guys, this carries over 100% into our homes and into our marriages. The whole body fitly joined together. We all need to be doing what we know we need to be doing. Here's the problem, and I'll get to that here in a minute. Even sometimes when we have done so well for so long, and people will look up to us, and we've all seen it happen where somebody makes, I can't even call it a mistake, somebody chooses to sin, and then we look at that person and we're like, how could they do that? Because literally it was somebody I looked up to or somebody that I thought would never do something like that, and then we find out that in weakness they did. And I think it's important that we understand, I'm not condoning. I'm saying I think it's important that we understand that every single person is susceptible to sin, and it may be in some different area. Far too many people, I think, when you begin to look at not only the home, but also the church, far too many people are more than content to let somebody else do what they need to be doing. You may say, can you give me an example? I don't know. There's an awful lot of people who think it's the responsibility of the preacher to come up and to teach, and yet they won't go home and they won't open up their Bibles, nor do they have their children read their Bibles, or even suggest the idea, right? That's the preacher's job. Or they bring their little children here to the building, and they think it's the teacher's job to take the little ones in and to teach them. And then they go home, they don't ever talk about the Bible. They don't talk about spiritual things with their children. That's not their job, when in fact we know that it is. The root of the problem is they're not leading. And it's not an option. As a parent, whether you like it or not, you're going to lead. You better. Because if you're not leading them to heaven, you're leading them to hell. There's no other option. And I know that people aren't going to like when I say that, but it's true. And here's the thing. When we're surrounded by faithful Christians, it's interesting how you can look at a faithful Christian who you know is striving. I'm not saying they're perfect. I'm saying they're working hard to do what they can do. And a lot of times what that does is it literally motivates. It's good for the men of the congregation to be close with one another so we can see when they're doing well, and it encourages us. The women of the congregation to be strong and close with one another so they can see where somebody's doing really well, but at the same point they can reach out when they're not doing well. And it usually will motivate us as followers to get to work and do the same thing. You see that if you go back to Nehemiah. They actually built the walls of Jerusalem there in 52 days. Nehemiah 6:15, and in Nehemiah 4:6, so built we the wall, and the wall was joined together under the half thereof, for the people had a mind to work. You guys ever notice how it's contagious? Faithfulness is contagious. Lukewarmness is contagious. Error is contagious. We have to choose which one. And it's going to be work. Your faithfulness may cause somebody else to say, listen, I'm struggling, but I see that they've done it. It gives you the hope that you can do it. And when they're not doing well, when they are struggling, we need to come alongside them and show them how a faithful Christian does it. How do they parent? How do they interact within their marriages? How do they share the faith while they're at work? All of those things are things that we ought to be thinking about on a regular basis. And you may say, I'm not a leader. I'm not a leader. Yes, you are. There is no choice but to lead. You're going to lead in some way. Another leadership trait that's often, not only is it overlooked, it is completely looked at as being an inferior position of leadership. People wouldn't even see that it's leadership at all, and that is our servitude towards others. It is often just viewed right by, and people don't look at those who are doing the serving. They don't even think about it. They never think about saying thank you. And yet you go back and you look at Jesus, who literally taught his apostles the importance of servant leadership. In John 13:12 through 15, as he's washing their feet, he was teaching them to serve others. Listen to what he says in Matthew 20, starting in verses 25. But Jesus called them unto him and said, Ye know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them? But it shall not be so among you. But whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister or your servant. And whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant. Even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for many. I probably should go back and spend some time. You guys know who does the best job of servitude leadership? I've never seen it done better probably than, and I hate to say this, the women as a whole in the church seem to be the ones that are more than willing to oftentimes serve in many, many regards. Not that men don't serve also, they do. But it seems like for many of them, they're the first ones to choose to be some type of carrying out a work of servitude. And Jesus, he teaches and he lives out the lesson right before them to say that there is no greater leader than the one who serves. Servitude should be done by every single one of us. Every single one. And guys, to be honest, I think it is here. I've pointed out, like, somebody's got to change light bulbs. Somebody has to vacuum the carpet. Somebody has to shovel the snow, put the salt down, shovel the driveway, replace the mailbox that just got knocked off by the plow truck. Somebody has to do all of that, right? Who's going to choose to serve? Unfortunately, in many congregations, there's a lot who will not. And we have heard of, or at least I have, of congregations who could not get enough people, for example, to teach the children. Or they couldn't find anybody to teach a Bible class. And they couldn't find anybody to do whatever it was that needed to be done. Let's look at a couple of examples of failures in leadership roles. And let's remember before I go into this, and I want you to apply this to yourself. One failure does not define you. One failure does not define you. I don't know what you maybe have done in your life. I don't know how heinous somebody said it was or how heinous you think it was. I don't know if you can't even forgive yourself for something that you have done. One failure does not define you. Don't let it. Because I know within our mind we do that to ourselves. And I'm sure David did too, so let's talk a little bit about David. Because no matter how faithful of an example you are as a leader, I want you to realize there are some people who are going to choose not to follow. And also remember that your choice on the flip side of the coin to be unfaithful may impact generations of people. Generations. Let's consider the sin of David here for a minute. And when you think about David, it's not often, they don't normally think of David, the man after God's own heart, right? It's David, the one who literally committed adultery with Bathsheba. Well, and then you got to cover it up, so let's just kill her husband. Guys, as horrible as that is, that should not define David. Listen to 2 Samuel 11:2. And guys, let me say this to anybody watching this online. I can't remember when. I covered the account with David and the consequences that David dealt with because of his actions years ago. I don't remember the name of the sermon. I don't remember what it was called or even when I preached it. I remember preaching it. So if you're watching YouTube, just dig through until you find it. It's there. 2 Samuel 11:2-3. And it came to pass in an evening tide that David arose from off of his bed, and he walked upon the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. And David sent and inquired after the woman, and one said, I like how this servant says this, is not this Bathsheba the daughter of Eliam and the wife of Uriah the Hittite? He's being pretty careful how he addresses the king, isn't he? He's reminding, you want me to go get who? Bathsheba? You mean the one who is married to Uriah the Hittite? I think he was trying to remind him, like, Why? What are you doing? Well, what David saw at that time led him to send somebody to go and get Bathsheba. We see actually the purpose behind why he did and the actual effect of going and retrieving her. So what he saw led him to send for her. Again, what did he see? Well, he looked at this woman and she was very beautiful to look upon, so he sends for her. There was an awful lot that he couldn't see at the time. He didn't see the consequences for Bathsheba. He didn't see in advance her guilt of being involved in this fornication, this sin. He didn't see that, or at least he didn't care about it at the time. He didn't see about the harm that it was going to do to her home. I doubt at the time he sent for her, he's already thinking in his mind, hey, I'm going to have to kill her husband now. I'm sure that wasn't running through his mind, so he didn't see that. He didn't foresee the fact that she would become pregnant. He didn't see the fact that later she would have grief over the fact that both her child and her husband were dead. He didn't see the consequences of, again, Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, having to be murdered for him to try to go back and to cover up and hide his sin. And guys, let me say this about David for just a second. I want you to imagine for just a second somebody who is being described as a man after God's own heart, who literally is leading a nation of those who are the followers of God, but instead of leading and showing them how to be faithful, he goes and he literally commits sexual sin and even murder. And he didn't consider any of the possible consequences to his actions. And let me say this, that's the case for all of us. When we go out and we choose to commit sin of some sort, we are not looking down the potentials of what could this possibly do. How many families will I destroy? How many children's lives will I destroy? How many people will look at me and maybe walk away from the church or decide not to go to church? Or what am I doing by choosing to be involved in this? David didn't do any of that. He didn't see the consequences for his unborn child. 2 Samuel 12, 14 through 15. That child would be sick and that child would die as a newborn as a consequence of his sin. And I covered this in that lesson I just mentioned earlier. I don't remember when I preached it or even, I think it was here. Pretty sure it was. He didn't see the consequences that he and his family were going to deal with. Let me just give you a few of the things that David dealt with, and all of this was really as a result of this account with Bathsheba. He couldn't have foreseen the fact that his daughter Tamar was going to be raped by her half-brother Amnon, or that eventually Amnon would be killed by her brother Absalom in retaliation for what he had done. He didn't see the betrayal of his most trusted counselor, who later actually came back and betrayed him to support the rebellion of David, of David's son Absalom. And if you go back and look, guys, the reason he most likely did that was he was actually Bathsheba was actually his granddaughter. And it appears that he did that in retaliation for what David had actually done and the damage he had done to not only Bathsheba, but to, again, Uriah the Hittite and their family. David didn't foresee any of that. He didn't foresee the fact that his son Absalom would actually be a rebellious son, ultimately would try to overthrow David, and then would be killed by Joab and his armor bearers. He didn't see any of that. And all of that came as a consequence of the things that David chose to do with Bathsheba. David didn't see that the pleasure of sin is really only for a season, Hebrews 11, 24 through 27. Nor did he see that every sin is ultimately against God. Now he sees it later, Genesis 39, 7 through 9. I don't think he realized, he probably thought in his mind, it's one time going to do, right? It's not bad. And it was, and it impacted multiple families and generations. And let me say this. I said, let's start off by saying one sin does not define you. David was a great leader most of the time. But when he chose not to, it led to havoc within his family. And not only did it lead to havoc within his family, it literally led It's hard to believe that the sin of committing fornication would lead you to kill somebody. The man after God's own heart killed another man to hide what it is he had done. And here's the crazy part. If you step back and look at that, you're like, God knew what he did. He wasn't hiding anything from God. He was trying to hide it from other men. Let's talk about Eli for a minute, because David already shows us what will happen to our families, or could potentially happen to our families when we choose to sin, and the impact it has within our family. Eli, listen to 1 Samuel 2:12. Now the sons of Eli were sons of Belial. They knew not the Lord. How would you like to be remembered in the Bible like this? And here's what's interesting, because when you read that, you have to say, well, how in the world did this happen? How did this happen? Because Eli is the high priest of Israel. And so you read that type of a statement and you go, now wait a minute. Eli was a good guy. But you're telling me that his sons were the sons of Belial and they knew not the Lord? Again, how did that happen? Well, when it says they didn't know the Lord, what it's talking about is the fact that they in no way respected God's authority. His sons literally abused their position as priests for selfish gain. They showed disregard for the sacrifices that they were administering, right? They even used the women who served outside the tabernacle for their own pleasure. I'm not going to go much more than that. You guys know what I'm talking about. And you have to go back and ask yourself, now, again, how did this happen? Listen to 1 Samuel 2:22. Now Eli was very old, and heard all that his sons did unto all Israel. Here's the part I wasn't going to say. I'll just let the Bible do it. And how they lay with the women that assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. Let's pause for a minute. Eli, great guy. I'll give you a little more information about him. Great guy. His sons, who are priests, are laying with the women that assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. It doesn't get much worse than that, right? And then eventually a word comes from the Lord, 1 Samuel 3:13. For I have told him that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity, the sin, which he knoweth. Listen to this. Not which he doeth, which he knoweth. He wasn't doing this stuff, but he knew about it because his sons made themselves vile. How? They were sleeping with the women at the door of the congregation there, at the tabernacle, right? Which he knoweth because his sons made themselves vile, and he restrained them not. Now, here's what's interesting. God condemns Eli's failure as a father, even though Eli himself was a good, moral person. You go back and read the scriptures, Eli is not described as a drunkard, as a wife beater, as a thief. He's not described in any of these ways, right? We don't get the indication that he was beating on his wife and cheating on her and doing all these things. Matter of fact, everything we see within the scriptures is this guy was a great man of God, but he was a horrible father. And you may say, how can those two even coincide? Well, God holds him accountable, and I'm going to talk about how can the two even coincide here for a minute. And I can't really blame one 100% more than the other because it's sad in either way. But God holds him accountable. He's a good man of God, great man of God. He's moral, but his sons are not. And I'm going to say this. I don't think there's anything more sad than for a follower of God to raise children who reject God. And for those of us that find ourselves in that position, we literally, not only do we have to, we probably will lament the rest of our life asking ourselves, is there something I could have done different? Could I have done something different? The answer may have been no, but the answer may have also been, yeah, there's a lot we could have done different. It's sad either way. Eli, I know, had a hectic life as a high priest. He had a number of responsibilities that he had to carry out. As a matter of fact, they were responsibilities given by God himself for the high priest to carry out. But Eli's many important things that he had to perform as the high priest did not excuse his discipline over his sons or did not remove his requirement to be a faithful father and to restrain his sons. And many people will say, well, he was a high priest. He was busy all the time. Let me make this statement. If you've got a job that is keeping you from parenting your children, you need to find a different job. I know that when I was in school to become a minister, they told us if at any point you cannot be a faithful parent or a husband because you are too busy with the work of the church, you better quit the work of the church. Right? You can try to save everybody else in a congregation and find your whole family has already walked away. And if it gets to that point, they said, just it's time to move on. Give up the work of the church and try to save your family. But we have to carry that to ourselves and think about our jobs, the things in our life, right? You got hobbies taking you away from your children? Working on a car or doing whatever it is you want to do for fun, you're going to tell me that's more important than trying to get your children to heaven? And yet they will. Eli was a spiritual leader. He's literally the high priest mediating between the nation of Israel and God, a position actually ordained and set in place by God. The one who's literally setting the spiritual direction for all of God's people, greatly respected by the nation, and yet his children didn't respect him at all, and not only that, they didn't respect God. And so while he's out doing all this work to lead the nation of Israel, his children just walked astray. It's extremely sad. It's extremely sad. Guys, I went back and checked this week. Listen to this. There's a recent study that came out, and it varied a little bit, not only on ethnicity, but also on a few other factors. But a recent study showed that as high as 50% of ministers' children have left the faith or are only minimally involved. Now, there was a number of reasons for their departures, but I want you to think about this for a second. Those children in that study were raised by religious parents. If you're a parent here and you're here today, I'm going to use the words description. You are a religious parent, right? You're religious. It's not the words I really like, but that's what the study shows. What does that show? What does that show me? You can be faithful or trying to be faithful. You can be interested in things of God. You can be moral, and your children may still walk away. Eli doing all the good that he did, and his children, you don't describe it any worse than what they were. Matter of fact, somebody said, well, wait. Now, certainly Eli didn't agree with this, right? Didn't he object to his kids? Yeah, listen to 1 Samuel 2:23. And he said unto them, Why do ye such things? For I hear of your evil doings by all the people. So yeah, he didn't agree with it. Yet here's what's interesting. He didn't agree with it. But when you go back and you read, the Lord says, I'm going to hold you accountable, Eli, because you did not restrain them. 1 Samuel 3:13. You didn't restrain them. The point is, Eli did far less than he could have or that he should have done to try to rein in these children who were going astray. And guys, you don't go from being a faithful follower of God as an Israelite to the next day being the most heinous follower of God who's literally laying with people outside the tabernacle. That doesn't happen in one night. It doesn't. What in the world could Eli have done in between there to here to rein them back in? Guys, we can be living faithful in our individual lives and yet still see our children leave the faith. It's even possible that we could have done something to stop it. Very possible. Now, I will say this. Again, it is possible that you could have done the best that you could have done and you tried, and your children by their own free will said, I'm not going to be involved in that, and they have been, in essence, guys, they have been overtaken by the world. You may have tried, and as you look back, I'm sure we all are killing ourselves right now, For those of us who have children who are not faithful and we're saying, could I have done something better? Maybe the answer is you couldn't have. Maybe the world had its reins in them too hard, and no matter what you tried, guys, they have free will. If they decide to walk away, they can. But I'm going to be honest with you. Most of us, if we're looking back, will say, I think I could have done something more. And here's what's sad, guys. For those of us that think there is something we could have done more, we have to live with that. You're going to have to live with that and always wonder, could I have done something more? Here's the bottom line. If we're living the Christian life to its fullest, we're going to be influencing other people in many different ways. The goal is to lead them to Christ. And we're going to set ourselves apart from the world in a lot of different ways, trying to be examples worthy of imitation. And that's going to open an awful lot of doors. And guys, just remember this. Just because you're faithful doesn't mean that your children will be. And we must be especially diligent to try to live out and pass down the faith to our loved ones and to those who are around us. I guess I would say it this way. You may not think you're a leader. You don't have any other choice but to be a leader. There is no other alternative. And as I draw this to a close today, our concern is for anybody who maybe has not yet obeyed the gospel. Let me give you the most simple way to become a Christian, because I'm just going to tell you what the Bible tells you. I'm not going to quote the verses by memory like I normally do. To become a Christian is very simple. Look at the conversion accounts. They taught who Jesus was, that He was the Messiah. And they had faith in Him and believed that He was the Messiah, John 8:24. They had faith, Hebrews 11:6. They understood sin and they were willing to repent of it. Luke 13:3 and 5. Jesus says you need to repent. We find them confessing Christ with their mouth, Romans 10:9 and 2, Matthew 10:32 and 33. We find them being immersed in water in every conversion account for the remission of sins. Jesus teaches it in Mark 16:15 and 16. Peter taught it in the very first gospel sermon, Acts 2:38. We find that people were hearing that and then being baptized into Christ, Galatians 3:26 and 27. Becoming a new creation in Christ, Romans 6:3 and 4, through this burial in water. And then they were striving to be faithful, 2 Timothy 4:7 and 8, to receive that crown of life. That's how you become a Christian. That's what the Bible teaches. And if there's a way we can help you in any way, you can come forward as we're led in a song of invitation.